4 times I stood at absolute zero. Not low, not struggling, but zero, with borrowed money in my pocket and a fortune that had evaporated so completely it was as if it had never existed. The first time, it broke my heart. The second time, it broke my pride. And somewhere in the wreckage of those ruins, I learned the single most important truth of this entire business. The one no trading course will ever sell you because there is no profit in it. The speculator, who has never been wiped out, has not yet finished his education. Ruin is not the end of the game. Ruin is the teacher, the harshest and most honest instructor a man will ever have. And the ones who survive it are not the ones who avoided the fall. They are the ones who had the character to climb back up. Let me be clear about something, because it will save you years of shame. To be reduced to nothing is not, in itself, a mark of failure. It is a rite of passage, a common and often necessary experience in the life of any man who dares to engage with the market on a serious level. The true test of a speculator's character is never whether he can avoid being knocked down. Every man of any ambition gets knocked down. The test is whether he possesses the fortitude, the intelligence, and the raw courage to get back up, wiser and colder and harder than he was before. What I am going to give you now is the anatomy of that comeback, the science of starting over, drawn from the only laboratory that ever mattered to me, which was my own repeated destruction and repeated resurrection. My first descent into the abyss was a lesson in the danger of a system that has never been tested outside the room it was born in. I began as a boy, a prodigy in the bucket shops, the boy plunger they called me. And in that simple, fast-moving world, my method of pure tape reading was very nearly infallible. I had, I believed, solved the game. So I came to New York with a real stake and an even larger supply of confidence. Certain I could apply my bucket shop methods to the New York Stock Exchange and reap the same spectacular harvest. I could not. The conditions were fundamentally different. The ticker ran behind. My executions were no longer instantaneous, so the price I saw was not the price I got. The scale of the capital was vastly larger, and the friction of that difference devoured me. My old system, so perfect for its original environment, was a broken and useless tool in this new and more complex arena, and the market, in its cold and impersonal way, proceeded to teach me exactly that. It wiped me out completely. The capital I had built over years of success was simply gone, and I was forced to borrow a small stake from a friend just to keep breathing. The lesson carved into me was this: a method is only as good as the conditions it was built for. A speculator must be a perpetual student of changing conditions, and he must possess the intellectual flexibility to abandon a beloved system the instant the ground beneath it shifts. My first ruin was the price I paid for the rigidity of youth, for the arrogance of a boy who thought that because he had won in one arena, he had conquered them all. It was expensive tuition. It was also cheap compared to what came next. My second downfall was far more instructive, because it was born not of inexperience, but of its exact opposite, the supreme arrogance and emotional recklessness that can follow a massive, historic success. In the Great Panic of 1907, I had cemented my legend. I had read the coming collapse correctly, sold the market short, and emerged with a fortune of several $1 million. They called me the Great Bear of Wall Street, a man who had stared into the financial abyss and walked out a king. And it was that very success, that intoxicating triumph, that laid the foundation for my next catastrophe. Understand this, because it is one of the most dangerous truths in the profession. A man who has just made a great fortune is in the most perilous psychological state a speculator can occupy. He begins to feel infallible. His respect for the market's inherent risk quietly evaporates. He forgets that he is a student and begins to believe he is the master. That hubris led me into cotton, where I intended to become nothing less than the Cotton King. I built a monstrous position, a line so vast it dwarfed even my boldest trades of the past. I was no longer speculating with care. I was betting with the reckless abandon of a man who had convinced himself he could not lose. Worse, and this was the true poison, I had allowed another man's opinion to override my own reading of the tape. A charismatic cotton expert whose bullish vision I adopted as my own. I had violated my most sacred rule, the rule that a speculator relies only upon his own study of the facts in front of him. When cotton turned against me, the tape gave me a clear and unmistakable signal to get out. A small loss in that moment would have been nothing, a minor scratch. But my ego and my loyalty to another man's forecast would not permit me to take it. I held on. I began to hope, and hope, in speculation, is the beginning of death. I did more than hold. I began to average down, throwing good money after bad, convinced I could force the market to bend to my personal will. The result was a monumental disaster. Cotton collapsed and took every dollar with it, plunging me from millionaire into deep debt. This second start from zero was infinitely more painful than the first, precisely because it was not the product of ignorance. It was the product of a willful, arrogant violation of rules I already knew to be true. And here is where a man's true character is finally tested, in the smoking aftermath of a self-inflicted wound. It is easy, it is the most natural thing in the world, to blame the market, to blame bad luck, to blame the man whose advice you took. The amateur always finds an external villain for his own failure. I refused to. I knew the market was an impersonal force, with no malice and no memory. I knew there was exactly one person responsible for my ruin, and he was the man staring back at me in the mirror. This single act, the act of taking absolute and total personal responsibility, is the cornerstone of every recovery I ever made. A man who blames others for his losses is a man condemned to repeat them, because he has learned nothing he can use. A man who blames himself holds the power to diagnose the disease and cure it. So in the quiet, humiliating years of that second exile, I did the hard work. I pored over my records. I performed an autopsy on the cotton campaign, tracing the failure back to its root, my own ego, my own hope, my own decision to trust a man's charm over the market's facts. I cut my personal expenses to the bone, a brutal lesson in humility and in respect for capital. I swallowed my enormous pride and borrowed a new, small stake. I was starting again, not as a king this time, but as a student, which is what I should have remained all along. Not every fall came from a bad trade. When the exchange closed in 1914, at the outbreak of the Great War, the market became a whirlwind of rumor and fear, and countless traders gambled themselves into ruin on wild guesses about the political future. I did something different, something the earlier version of me could never have done. I stood aside. The tape was telling no clear story, and in the absence of a clear signal, my rule was to do nothing at all. I was in cash, my capital untouched, when the shutdown trapped and destroyed men all around me. And yet even I was left at a kind of zero, a speculator with no market to speculate in, a general with no battlefield. But I did not waste those months in bitter frustration. I used them to study, to think, to prepare my mind for the entirely new game that the war would forge. That stretch of enforced stillness taught me perhaps the most underrated lesson of all. Sometimes the most profitable thing a man can do is absolutely nothing, and the quiet times exist to be used, not endured. My final and most tragic downfall came, cruelly, after my single greatest triumph. Applying every hard-won principle I had bled for, I read the great crash of 1929 correctly, shorted the market, and accumulated the largest fortune of my life. I had reached the absolute summit, and it was from that dizzying height that my last, slow, irreversible descent began. This time there was no single fatal trade to point to, no one violated rule. It was a slow, grinding disintegration of the man himself. My private life was in turmoil, racked by costly divorces and personal tragedies that would have crushed any man. The immense, unrelenting pressure of guarding such a vast fortune wore at me. The market itself was changing beneath my feet, reshaped by new regulations that dismantled the freewheeling game I had mastered. But the deepest cause was something quieter and more human: exhaustion, mental and spiritual, the depletion that comes after nearly 40 years of unbroken warfare against one's own nature. My nerve began to fray. I made uncharacteristic errors. I wandered into ventures outside my expertise. The clear, cold, objective mind that had been my only true asset grew clouded by the fog of my own inner turmoil, and by the mid-1930s, I was bankrupt for the last time, with no comeback left in me. I tell you this not for sympathy, but for instruction, because even a man's final failure has lessons buried in it for those willing to dig. So what is the true lesson threaded through this entire cycle of ruin and rebirth? It is that speculation is, first and last, a test of character. It is a man's own weaknesses, his own emotional and psychological flaws, that are his greatest and most persistent enemy, far more dangerous than any market condition. Any man can lose his capital. That is simply part of the game. The mark of a real speculator is not his ability to avoid loss, but his ability to endure it, to extract its lesson, and to begin again. To start from zero is not a disgrace. It is an opportunity, a rare chance to shed old habits, correct flawed thinking, and open a new campaign with a clean slate and wisdom that was paid for in the only currency the market respects, which is defeat. Now let me give you the actual blueprint, the road back from zero, because principles without a procedure are just poetry. The first and most essential step is a profound and unflinching act of self-analysis. The broken speculator must look into the pitiless mirror of his own results and say, with absolute conviction, the market was not wrong, my judgment was wrong. He must understand that the market is an impersonal, infallible machine that merely registers the facts of supply and demand. It has no opinion, no cruelty, no favorites. A loss is not a punishment. It is the market's impartial verdict on a flawed opinion. By accepting this, the speculator transforms himself from a helpless victim into a scientist examining a failed experiment. His job is not to curse the laws of nature, but to study his own procedure and locate the precise source of his error, whether that error came from ignorance of a principle or from weakness in following one he already knew. The reason does not matter. The fault is his, and owning it is the cleansing fire every man must pass through before he can be reborn a professional. The second step is immediate and ruthless, the protection of whatever capital remains. A speculator's capital is his lifeblood, his ammunition, the very tool of his trade. Without it, he is not in the business. The man who has suffered a great loss must instantly and drastically slash his personal expenses, abandon the lifestyle of the successful man he used to be, and adopt the frugal habits of someone starting over. Every remaining dollar must be treated with something close to reverence. The desire to keep up appearances is a form of vanity a broken speculator simply cannot afford. A man with $1 is still a speculator. A man with zero is a former one. And this forced frugality does something more than preserve money. It is a daily reminder of the cost of his mistakes, and it rebuilds his respect for capital, a respect almost always lost in the heady days of easy success. The man who learns to live on little is a man no longer enslaved by the constant need for profit, and a man who does not need to win is a man who can finally afford to be patient. The third step is to forge a new and unbreakable constitution. Before he makes a single trade, he must set down definite, inviolable rules for managing risk, because he has just learned in the most brutal way imaginable what happens to the man who trades without them. He must decide, in the cold light of reason, the absolute maximum fraction of his capital he will ever risk on one idea, and that figure should be small, perhaps 1 or 2% of his total stake. That is his insurance premium against his own fallibility, the mathematical guarantee that no single misjudgment can ever again wipe him out. And he must recommit, with religious devotion, to the stop-loss, deciding in advance exactly where his opinion will be proven wrong, and honoring that point without hesitation or negotiation. These rules are not suggestions. They are the supreme law of his new business, and to break them even once is to take the first step back toward ruin. The fourth step is the return to the market, but it must be a cautious, humble, and scientific return. A broken man cannot come back with his old bold and aggressive posture, because his nerve has been shaken, and his confidence must be rebuilt slowly, brick by careful brick. So he begins with a deliberately, almost absurdly small position. The purpose of these first trades is not to make money. It is twofold. First, to test his reforged discipline under real pressure, to prove he can cut a small loss without flinching and sit with a small gain without fear. Second, to rebuild his confidence, because a series of small trades executed flawlessly according to plan will heal a shattered nerve faster than any amount of abstract study. It is living proof to his own mind that he has learned. To come back large, under the pressure of needing a big score, is a fatal error that invites the old demons of fear and greed straight back to the table. That leads to the fifth and most psychologically brutal step, the total conquest of the urge to win it back quickly. This is the great enemy of every comeback, the gambler's instinct, the desperate craving to erase a monstrous loss with one heroic, spectacular trade. It is born not of a desire for money, but of a wounded ego crying out for redemption, the need to prove to the market and to himself that his failure was a fluke and he is still the master. The market does not care about a man's need for redemption. The road back is not a sprint. It is a long, methodical marathon made of 1,000 small correct steps. The speculator must consciously abandon all thought of his past losses and treat his new small stake as if it were his first and only stake. His goal is not to win back the million he lost, but to correctly manage the 1,000 he now holds. Focus only on the present and on flawless execution, and the profits will, in time, take care of themselves. The man who tries to get rich quick a second time is the man destined to go broke a second time. The sixth step is turning failure into education. The amateur repeats his mistakes. The professional dissects them. The wiped-out speculator must become a cold, objective student of his own follies, keeping a detailed journal of his trades, especially the losing ones, and performing an honest autopsy on each. What was my original premise? At what exact point was it proven wrong? Why did I fail to act on that evidence? Was it ignorance, a flaw in analysis, or weakness, a violation of a rule I knew? He must be brutal with himself, because a loss that does not produce a new written rule or reinforce an old one is a loss completely wasted, a tuition fee paid to the market for an education the student refused to collect. The seventh step is the re-enthroning of the one quality that makes all the others possible: absolute discipline over one's own emotions. The great battle of speculation is not waged against the market, but against the primal, destructive human instincts of hope, fear, and greed. A man who is a slave to these can never succeed, and discipline is the only weapon that conquers them. Discipline is not a feeling. It is a willed act, the conscious subordination of emotional impulse to a proven system of rules. The man starting from zero must become a fanatic for it, because he has seen, in the evidence of his own empty pockets, exactly what happens when discipline is allowed to lapse for even a moment. The eighth and final step is the cultivation of patience, the discipline of trading only when there is a clear and definite advantage, when the market's own action aligns perfectly with sound principle. The amateur, and especially the one trying to win back a loss, is desperate for action and will trade on minor fluctuations and pure hope, and the market will punish that impatience without mercy. The rebuilding professional knows his capital is too precious to gamble on weak signals. He waits with the calm vigilance of a sniper for the one high-probability opportunity, and he knows such moments are rare. He may sit in cash for weeks, watching, studying, doing nothing, and that period of inaction is the most difficult and most profitable work he does. He acts only when the line of least resistance is clear, when a leading stock reaches its pivotal point, when volume confirms the move, and the general market is in harmony, only when the probabilities are overwhelmingly stacked in his favor. That is the complete blueprint. It begins not with a tip, but with an unflinching act of self-analysis and the full acceptance of personal responsibility. It proceeds through the defensive work of protecting capital, cutting expenses, and defining the rules of risk. It moves to a cautious, humble re-entry with a small stake, aimed only at rebuilding confidence and testing discipline. It demands the conquest of the gambler's urge and its replacement with the professional's patient, one step at a time march. It requires that every past mistake be forged into a future lesson, And it culminates in a mind ruled by discipline rather than emotion, a method built on patience rather than the constant craving for action. The journey from zero is the hardest a speculator will ever make, and also the most educational. The man who has been broken and has had the character to rebuild himself along these lines is a man who will not easily be broken again. He has passed through the fire and come out as tempered steel. He knows himself. He knows his enemy. And at last, he knows the rules of the game. I fell 4 times, and I will not pretend the 4th fall did not keep me down. But the climbs taught me everything the peaks never could. And if you learn nothing else from a man who made and lost more than most men will ever see, learn this. The question was never whether you will fall. You will. The only question that has ever mattered is whether you have the character to make the hard rock of your own failure the foundation of your next and greatest victory.